Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome back to the BVM Super Bandit build. We are continuing on with our hatches. This is video number 3 in the series. Let's dive back in with the main hatch. So over the past couple days, we've spent quite a bit of time on this front canopy, a total of about 7 hours just on the front canopy. But I gotta say, it is really worth it. The fit of this is beautiful. We've got a little bit of touch-ups to do when we're getting towards our final, but otherwise this fit beautifully. It's very easy to remove, it's very solid, and worked out really well. So happy with the results there. Now, fitting the front canopy is the critical first step, because now we're moving on to the main hatch. Now, one of the things we're going to do different than the stock setup. Now, the stock setup, you would generally put your latches on the front part of the rear hatch. So they'd go right here and you'd pull them back, tuck the back end of this hatch in the fuselage like this, and you'd install that back hatch. Now, the downside of doing latches on the hatch is that generally they're going to hit this part of the fuselage and you're going to get a little scrape or damage there over time. So what we'll do that's different is we're going to reverse these guys and we're going to put the latches on the fuselage. So we did this previously. I put a piece of tape across here. When I had some extra High-Sol mixed up, we filled the areas where the pins are supposed to, or the latches are supposed to come through with High-Sol. Now this is the area where we're going to have our hole drilled, and our latch of course is going on the other side on the fuselage. So we're in the manual, we've worked through the front, now we are working through the main hatch. So be certain that the canopy hatch is seated full forward. We've spent a bunch of time making sure that happens. We still have just a little bit of play here, but your double check is when you push this forward, it should be flush with this right back here. So we're gonna maybe get that fit a little bit better, and we're gonna push this forward, probably tape it in place so we are perfect. And then the first big step here on the main hatch is we need to trim our corners and just do a little bit of light sanding just to make sure that this fits perfectly. So what we're looking to do with the main hatch is areas like this where our corners are not lining up properly. We've also got the main hatch sitting up just a thickness of a piece of paper from the front canopy. Once we sand this down, this will probably drop down. So we just want to spend some time working on that main hatch to get it fitting perfectly in the fuselage. All right, so moving on, after shaping the hatch as best as possible, we drilled 2 holes in the base of the aft section of the hatch. So it is 1/4 inch up from the base, 1/4 inch in from the wall, and we've matched that to both sides. So that is a 1/16 hole. From there, we install putty. So I installed fiberglass glazing putty on the back side. We just put a big dollop in there, and then we re-drilled the hole, the 1/16 hole. Then we take a 1/16 piece of pin, and this is 1 inch long. You leave 0.2 inches sticking past. CA that in place, and now we've got our 2 pins, our rear locating pins, installed. So next thing we need to do is we need to get our holes on the fuselage side done. Now, the point of doing these pins is, you can see here, so on this side of the fuselage, we are pretty much flush with the outside flange here. If we come around to the other side of the fuselage, there's a bit of a gap there, so the fuselage is sticking out a little bit. So the point of this is to get the pins located in the right spot so it lines up the hatch to the fuselage. When this is done, when we install our formers later on, I think it's the F6 former, that's going to keep the fuselage in that position and not just rely on the pins. So how we do this is we put a little bit of ink on the back of these pins. We're going to do one at a time and get this fit. If you mess it up, you just fill in the hole and start over again. needs to be in the right spot because this is determining how this hatch fits on the back end section. All right, so we've got our pins all lined up and everything, and that portion is done. The hatch is fitting really, really nice right now. Now, one thing that was fairly important to do is to get those holes installed, but then adjust the vertical position. So when I first got those holes done, the hatch was sitting lower than the back end of the fuselage. So I took my micro file here, my round one, and I just slowly made those notches up higher in the fuselage. And now our hatch is fitting perfectly flush with the fuselage. So really, really nice fit right there. So next thing we're working on is our rear top hatch hooks. Now, this is on the same back end or aft end as the pins. So what we do here is there was a little piece sticking off the front edge. We cut that off so we get a little bit more of that pin sticking out past the hatch. So we're going to glue one of these in one at a time. So we're going to get that glued. We're going to install the hatch on the fuselage, and then we can locate the hook from the underside of the fuselage. So we'll tape that hatch closed, flip the fuselage upside down, and wherever that hatch hook is sitting, we'll put a little pencil mark there, and we'll start making a notch for our hooks to hold in. All right, so we've got our back hooks installed. I just did everything from the underside here, so I notched out the fiberglass on the fuselage with a file and just fit those beautifully, and then installed them, put some CA on there, and they are fitting very nice right now. So we're going to pull that hatch off and check how everything is working. All right, so we've added our plywood backing pieces on the back side of the fuselage. Now the kit only came with one, so I just copied it and made a second one. So those are just spot glued with CA right now for positioning, and then all of this stuff will get aero epoxy when it's complete. All right, so moving on to the rear hatch here, we are getting our latches ready to go. So all I've done here is taken the initial square that was on the hatch portion. We've just taken a straight edge and transferred that over to the fuselage. Now our actual dimensions will need to be adjusted a little bit based on how the latch actually works, but we want that to be kind of as forward, in this case, backwards as possible. So we're going to be roughly about here, and that's what this mark is right there, is our furthest rearward mark. And then as we operate the hatch or the latch, it's going to come back to about this mark. So we'll start off with this cutout spacing, and we'll adjust from there. So first thing we'll do is we'll get our notches cut in there, get the latch sort of positioned. Other thing we'll need to do with that is get our hole drilled in this spot right here. Now on this side, our hole dimension is not as critical as the latch side. So this will take quite a bit of figuring out, but it should be a fairly straightforward setup because we've got those dimensions already done on our hatch side. Okay, so we've got our little hatch latch cut out there. It's a bit tricky because we're doing this on the fuselage side. So we've taken our latch itself and sanded down the one section of the latch right here. Now the point of that is to get this latch as close as possible to this joint in the fuselage and latch or hatch area. So what this has allowed us to do is when we install this, it's tucking up nice and close to here, and we're getting as much pin coming through as possible, which is the reason for all of this. So now we've got lots of pin coming through. Our latch goes all the way towards the this side right there, and we'll have lots of operating room to open that up. All right, we've got both hatch latches fit here, and they turned out awesome. The positioning of it is great. We've got just a couple final fitting pieces to do here. I believe the last step in this is the center hook right here. So I'll check the manual, get that figured out. Now we do have a bit of an adjustment here to make with that center hook. So we've got a kind of an overhang here. The hatch needs to shift this direction. So when I put that center hook in, I kind of want to take everything and just shift it over a little bit, and that brings everything into center very nicely. So we'll inspect that. We'll probably end up taping this, then marking it, and getting that front hook fit. All right guys, so hatch is done. I'm very happy with this. Reversing the latches makes things a little bit more complicated. Obviously right now with one hand it's fairly complicated, but so show you how the hatch fits here. So your back, you've got 4 connection points, right? Our 2 hooks, our 2 pins. And on the front here, the last step is we did the hook that centers the rear hatch on the front cockpit. So this doesn't hold anything because this little latch just slips into place and is centered left to right. So when we pop this guy in, on the back, pull our latches forward, this drops in, goes in, and it is a very solid fit. We've got 0 play there. When I did this, we kind of shifted it over into the right spot, put some tape here, put some tape there, marked our center point, and then we adjusted it with a file, and the fit is beautiful. So we've got a really nice fit here with the front canopy. All of our gaps, we're going to be filling those with high sol. We'll talk more about that later on, but right now, that is awesome. I think we still have a couple discs to install on the midpoint here to hold the mid hatches, but compared to the rest of it. All right guys, last step on the hatch here is we made some G10 tabs. Now these G10 tabs are on the side of the hatch, and those tabs interlock with these little channels right here that we made. Now what that does is that just creates support for the fuselage and the hatch, so this spacing right here always stays nice and tight and you don't get any movement in that location. So that is the final step on the hatch. Now what we're going to do is we're going to mix up some high sol, and we're going to go in and we are going to take care of all of our little pieces that we need to permanently glue at this point. All right, we've moved on to the hatch as the next step in the manual. Very straightforward. First thing we've done is locate our 4 tabs, get those glued in place. They're quite specific. These ones are kind of big, oblonged, funny looking ones. These are kind of the normal size ones. And then there's a bigger version of the normal size one that gets glued to the front edge here. We've gone ahead and drilled out the 4 pimples on our bottom hatch. And before I did that, I took a plane and just sanded off the little pimples so we had a little location to drill, and then we used a 1/16 drill bit to install those holes. All right, hatch time here. We're going a little above and beyond what is recommended in the instructions. Instructions call for 2, 2, and a single tabby. We are putting 2 more tabbies on the front, so the front corners. Polyply, we are running the polyply all the way around the perimeter. So it's going to go 1 big piece back here, 2 little pieces, 2 big pieces, 2 smaller pieces, all the way around. So that's the next thing we're doing, is getting these guys glued in place. Now we'll just glue these in place with some CA, and then we will use some high sol later on when we are ready to glue everything for the day. All right guys, we have glued all of our polyply strips in all the way around the hatch, and this really finished everything off nicely, so it is very stiff now. None of the areas flex in at all, and this is perfect. So what we need to do is drill these 3 front holes out, and that's a great next step, and then we'll get our screws figured out for this, but that finishes off the main hatch. All right, last step in the hatch here, we need to reinforce our screw locations. So took an X-Acto blade, we just cut out the balsa. This is actually really easy. Racking my head over how to get rid of this material, and just take an X-Acto knife and cut it out. It's quite easy. So we're going to fill these areas now with probably some high sol. We're going to let that cure, and then we'll be able to sand these down to make the hatch fit perfectly. But what that's doing is it's just adding support to this area for the screws and when the hatch sits against our tabs. All right, so finishing up the bottom hatch here, we have added some dams, some glue dams on the sides of the hatch. Now, this is just to keep the high sol in place. So we're going to fill each of those squares basically with high sol. And while we're doing our gluing, we are going to also glue all of our polyply and wood pieces that we've installed in the fuselage for that bottom hatch as well. All right, guys, it is the next day and we're moving on to some other things here, but we're going to get back to the hatch in a little bit. Now, I did glue in this step here, which is the support for the intake ducting. So that has been glued in. I glued that in last night because I mixed up a bunch of epoxy and I had some left over, so I just got that done. So the top side of that is right here. The underside is right there. So that is the duct support for the intake ducting. We're going to get back to the hatch here and get that 100% done. We did glue the insides of all this stuff, so our pieces of wood, our polyply strips all the way around, that's all glued in place. And then our little dams, I removed those this morning, but those are our epoxy backers that we did on our hatches. So those are also done now as well, which is good. So we can sand these down now and get this hatch fit in place. All right, so we've got our hatch all done, all fit. Everything is good to go with that. We've got a couple of things that we're gonna do on the hatch here. So what I'm gonna do is make a glue list or a to-do list. So I just keep a little record here of things that I need to remember to glue, because we don't need to do it now, we're gonna do it at the end of the day. So we've got a little, kind of just a little gap there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna glue the hatch to fill in that gap a little bit, and then we'll file that down. So this was just a little off-kilter cut, so we can fix that pretty easy. Our center two tabs here were kind of close to the edge, so I want to put a little bit of high sol or epoxy on the edge of those tabs to add some more support. And that's pretty much it. So the bottom hatch is done. Now we're moving on to the duct work. All right, so we're moving on to the duct work here. We've talked about this already. We have glued the top piece in. What I've done to fit the ducts is, first thing, we did a little bit of sanding on the inlet little lip there. That's got to be sanded out. And the ducts are marked right and left. So right there, there was a label on them, but we took the label off. So according to the instructions, next step is to fit the extension. So this extension is a 3-inch extension. So what I did here was, it does fit perfect on there. So I'll show you the overall length is 3 inches. They say to mark it at 2 inches. So I subtracted the little lip that goes over the intake ducts, and then our spacing here is 2 inches. Now this piece gets glued on to the bypass. It doesn't get glued on to the intake ducts. Then what they want you to do is to mark this at 2 inches and then cut it down. So I took a couple things here. I took my roll of tape and my square, then I put my Sharpie on top. I've got it marked at 2 inches, found the right spot, and then we just spin this while holding the Sharpie, and we get a nice, perfect line. Now, we could use a Dremel to cut this, but I've got my Cutco scissors, and now I'll just use these to cut the fiberglass duct down to my 2-inch mark. All right, just a little point of interest here. This is the point in the manual where things get simplified. So it even states it right here, where they're not going to tell you all the intricate things to do. You just have to use good building practice from this stage forward. So good building practice on the ducts. We want to sand all of the primer off the inlet lips here, which we've already done. We are going to sand this area right here, which we've done, because we're going to put a piece of cloth joining the duct to the fuselage. So that is good practice. We've also sanded back here where these ducts are going to stick together. And then this top area here, that's going to contact the support that's been glued in the fuselage. All right, so it's the next day, guys, and our ducting is nice and solid. One thing that I noticed here is we are going to have to cut this area out. That's looking at some of the pictures and stuff. This is a common thing, obviously, because the duct is in the way. You can't actually put the ducting here with this. So we'll cut that out at some point, not right now. Moving on to the front. This is the pump tray. This plane was originally designed for a jet cat, so that's why this is here, but that is where we'll put our fuel pump. The tank does mount right there in this area as well, so just something to consider. So this is pretty straightforward to assemble this piece. We got it fit inside the fuselage like that. The front tab just slides underneath with this former here, and this former gets glued in place and our two screws hold everything down. So I've taken a Sharpie, marked out where we need to sand the fuselage, and we will take this out now and get our contact areas sanded. All right, so we've spot glued that mounting plate into place and just use CA to do that. And we've taken our tray out, and now we will, probably at the end of the evening, we'll high sol this. The other thing I like to do, and I've done this to the front boards and formers and all that, you can see it's got a bit of a shine to it. So when we did our carbon reinforcement on the fuselage in this area, I had a little bit of West Systems epoxy left, so we ended up painting all of the former work in here just to protect it all, and we will do the same thing when we add our rear reinforcement for the stabs. All right, so the next thing we're supposed to work on here is the stab and fin mounting. Now we have a problem that we've run into, and this is not a good one. So the kit does not have our stab mounting aluminum blocks, which are these guys right here. Very critical, very important. So we are working on getting something figured out for that. I mean, I'm hoping BVM has it, but we need those two blocks. Can't really make them because I don't know the dimensions on them. And if I had one to copy, obviously that's easy. We could make a copy of it, but we don't have them. So that's a problem. So what we probably are going to end up doing here is skipping over some of these things. So I'm just going to mark this. Obviously we need to return back to this page. And so we've got cut all the holes in the rear of the fuse. We're going to skip that. Use a razor saw to cut elevators. We're going to skip that. We're going to skip that, skip that. So essentially we are skipping everything to do with the elevators or horizontal stab of this aircraft. So it's really all of this stuff. And we are going to, I think, move on to the vertical. I just need to check position of this to make sure that this doesn't interfere with our other pieces. So I'm going to check on this stuff and we'll come back to this. Okay, so our rudder mount here, our former that holds our vertical stab, we also can't really do that because we need our maple blocks to be installed for the horizontal stab. So this aluminum piece is definitely important, and it's going to hold us up here a little bit with the tail section. Now we do have our drawings here, which are all scale drawings. Problem is that this, I mean, it could be off just a little bit. I'm not comfortable just taking these dimension drawings and trying to copy that piece of aluminum times 2. So yeah, I'm not comfortable with that at all. So anyways, we're going to put the back end on hold. So we are stepping on to the next section in the manual here. So we've gone through all the stuff that we can't do with all the rear ends stuff. So what we're moving on to is F6 and elevator servo mounts. So F6 former is this guy right here, goes right, I guess, back of the engine opening. Goes there. We've got our elevator mount servos that goes right in front of the F6 former. So we're just going to start working on this stuff. First step is assembling the elevator mounts. You make a left and a right like that. So we will start off getting these things organized and put together. All right, so we're going to put our elevator servo mounts together here. Now what you want to do is you want to have a 90-degree block or a square or whatever you have. Get everything lined up here, and then we're just going to tack glue it with some medium CA and kicker. Afterwards, before I glue this into the fuselage, we'll come in here and put some epoxy along this joint as well too. So we did the back section there. Now we'll do the front section just to make sure that it is set up properly. So the 90 degree is important as good building practice, but also because they're recommending it in the manual as well too. And then we just go back and double check it, and we are all good there. All right guys, so we got our pieces ready to go here, and more importantly, we got the areas in the fuselage sanded out. So I've lined up all the pieces. You can kind of still see my Sharpie marks there. And what I do is I take my Dremel with my carbide bit, and we just sand a very wide area where our pieces are going to get glued in. I vacuumed it out, rubbed it with isopropyl alcohol, and now we've got a great gluing surface for our aero epoxy. Yeah, I find you always want to go wider than you need because you're going to have fillets of glue that need somewhere to contact. So we've done our carbon plate in the front, down here, our whole former piece, our F6 former that goes all the way around there. So that stuff's ready to glue. Now we do have a couple things that we're going to do here on the elevator servo mount. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a 3D printed carbon piece. So it's going to be some PETG carbon fiber filament. We're going to make a right angle that comes all the way down and is going to get high soled in place. So I'm doing that just as one more extra step. You could fiberglass over top of this. I think a nice black carbon finished piece would look really slick here, and I think it's going to work out really well. So I'm going to get those printed as well too. But step number one, we want to get all this stuff glued in place first. So what we're going to do is we are going to get our pieces spot put in place, and then from the back we're going to make sure our hatch is on, because this spacing here is important. And we're going to spot glue our former, this F6 former, and put a couple spots of CA all the way around that former, so we can take this hatch back off and the shape's all going to be held. So step by step, I'll show you quickly what we're doing here as we do it. So we'll pop our former in here. Now we'll get these guys installed, and I'll show you the next steps here. Okay, so we've got our structure installed, and the servo mounts and the bottom of this back former is spot glued in place. The top is still loose. From here up is still loose. So what we'll do now is we're going to install our hatch, and then we'll glue around the other area, spot glue it from the back end. All right, and there we go. So it's been spot glued in place. Now it is time to mix up some high sol and get gluing. All right guys, now a few weeks ago we got a printer here, the X1 Carbon from Bamboo Labs. Thank you Bamboo Labs for sending this to me. I don't think you watch my videos, but anyways, thank you, I appreciate it. Been having a ton of fun with this thing. Now we did print something specifically for the Super Bandit, a little reinforcement piece for the elevator servos. So I'll show you guys that stuff. Just a little plug for this thing. I don't get anything from it or anything like that, but this thing is amazing. I started off using their PETG filaments, or sorry, PLA filaments. Have been getting into the more technical filaments. So the pieces I'm going to show you were printed with PETG carbon fiber. Really, really cool finish. Super strong on these little pieces. Awesome. So I printed these last night. They took like a few minutes to design in Tinkercad, printed them. The thing I love about this machine is it just works. So here's the pieces that I printed. They are 2 millimeters thick, and I designed them, I think it was 8 millimeters by 8 millimeters was the total size. So they're pretty straightforward. They're just L brackets or L bends. They were printed in this configuration here. I printed them a little bit slower so the joint between the two surfaces would be strong. I actually printed 5 and I destroyed one of them just to confirm that it was a very strong print, which it is. So they're also very, very stiff. And then when we high sol these in place, they're going to be awesome. I'll show you where they're going. So overall, the elevator servo mount is good. We've got it high soled on all the surfaces. It doesn't get high soled to the fuselage here, which is fine. It's the way it's designed. So probably the weak point of all this is going to be the joint here between the upper piece and side piece. Now we could fiberglass this. The downside is that where our servo mounts here, we're not going to get a lot of overlap. So that's why I thought about making this piece. It's a little bit, we have to do a little bit of shaping and stuff now because of the high sol, but it's going to go right there, going to get high soled in place. We can sand this area out as needed, but that is going to be, I think, a really good reinforcement and really finish the servo mount off perfectly. All right, so I just trimmed this down just a little bit on my grinder. So now it's sitting in its home, and we actually got this size perfectly, and I didn't even really fully measure it, but it's actually flush with the opening, so we don't need to do any grinding in this location right here. It sits perfectly with that piece of wood. So that is exactly what I was hoping for. All right, so we've high soled our reinforcement pieces in place. Now this is one of those great spots where it works really well to, we covered the backside with high sol, get it pressed in place, and then just spot glue it with CA just to hold it in place, because there's really not any great locations to clamp this in place. And now it's stuck and not moving, and our high sol will cure overnight and it will be extra strong. Okay, so we've got our elevator servo washers left over. We've marked the bag. This is one of those great things to do as you go through a build like this, because when you get to the assembly portion of putting all the equipment in, you're gonna wanna know where all these parts are. So we'll just set that in our little parts department. All right, guys, and that is gonna wrap up our fuselage episode of the Super Bandit, which is video number 3. So in this one, we essentially got all of our hatches, including the bottom hatch. That was the big portion of the video. So that is some wicked progress. We are going to continue working on the tail very soon. We've got some aluminum blocks coming, and the aluminum blocks is what we're going to make our horizontal stab mounts from. So we're going to have to make those from scratch. So those are coming up as well too. So lots of good progress on the Super Bandit. If you guys have any questions or comments, list them down below. Other than that, thank you for watching. If you're not a subscriber, hit that subscribe button down below, give the video a thumbs up, and we'll see you in the next video.